Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. For today's topic, I'm going to discuss some of the methods people use to design their settings. Working out means starting by designing a small local area and building a world around it, while working in means creating a world full of nations and regions and then zooming in to a single area and a single location. Both methods have their advantages and disadvantages, and as you create your setting and the stories that use it, you may end up using both at different times. Big picture issues. The advantage of starting with a big picture with nations and wars and continents is that you can create conflicts and contrasts and build them right into the bones of your setting. If you want your setting to feature a big fight between good and evil, you can draw a map, draw a line that cuts right through it, and then put evil on one side and good on the other. That's all you really need for a skeleton, and from there you can build things up and flesh them out as your story or stories reach certain points along the map. The big picture approach is also useful for when you want to create places for all of the various races, species, or cultures to come from. You can create a map and say, this plains area is where the nomads come from. These woods are where the elves live, or else this galaxy sector is under the control of the warrior aliens. Or if geography isn't that important to your stories, or if you aren't that good at making maps, you can just use vague directions, like the most important country in this setting is in the middle, its rival is to the east, barbarians are to the west, a big empire is to the south, and there's an ocean to the north. It may not be as organized as a map, but it's still a big picture decision, and it gives you enough details to work with. Now, if your setting takes place on Earth, either because there's some alternate history going on or it's an Earthbound science fiction setting, you don't really need to draw a map. There are plenty of online options that you can choose from. Instead, the big picture approach means that you focus on the big differences between your setting and the real world and how that's affected all of the different nations, cultures, and economies. For instance, in the Shadowrun setting, the United States as we know it has fallen apart, partly because of internal strife, and partly because the Native Americans were empowered by the return of magic and took the opportunity to retake some of their old lands. For their part, Mexico's old government collapsed, and the new one has embraced the ancient Aztec culture. Small picture problems. Starting from the small picture means starting with your characters and building a world around them that suits the story you want to tell. If you want your protagonists to fight in a big war, you can create two big clashing empires. If you want your protagonists to travel around, you create interesting encounters and antagonists that fit the narrative and the themes you want to tell. Nothing exists until you put it to use, and after that point, it has always existed. The biggest benefit of the small picture approach is that you never waste any creativity. Everything you come up with for your setting has a practical reason to exist and features in one or more of your stories. The biggest downside is that you're likely to create setting inconsistencies and plot holes if what you invent one week doesn't match up with what you invented the week before. Fortunately, there are ways to minimize this issue. First, always keep track of important setting and character details in a set of notes you write as you create your stories. Second, always stay at least 2 steps ahead of your audience so that you can go back and fix your inconsistencies before anyone else encounters them. Even if you start with a small scale, you can still plan things out for the long term. The show Steven Universe is very much a small-scale series, and its creators refuse to answer questions like, why is most of North Asia missing from that map, and how is religion different when aliens are confirmed to exist and anyone can talk to them? The themes of Steven Universe are all about personal relationships, sexual preferences, and sexual identities, and so these questions do not and will never have answers because they aren't relevant to the story. However, the big twist about Steven's mother was planned out almost from the beginning because that is important to the story, and so in that respect, because it was planned out that far ahead, the story has strong internal consistency. Mixing methods. If you stick with a setting for long enough, and if you create a lot of stories that use that setting, then you may end up switching back and forth between extrapolating out from the small picture and filling in details around the big picture. There is absolutely nothing wrong with mixing these approaches, and depending on where you want your story to go next, or how you divide your stories up, it may in fact be the best way of maintaining that all-important setting consistency. I believe the Flying Island setting can provide a useful illustration for this point. In previous segments, I've already created some broad ideas for the setting, like how science and magic are in conflict, a patriarchal nation has a more egalitarian rival, and a newly discovered island could change the classist nature of magic forever. So let's take all of that as a given, and then jump straight down to the little picture. There's a woman named Laura, let's say, and she has a job as an airplane pilot. Does she work for a company, or is she independent? Let's say she works for a company. Is the company big or small? Let's make it big. Now, big companies tend to prefer the status quo since that's what keeps them big, so while the individual pilots are women, the management is all men, since they, like the status quo, are patriarchal. We've scaled up Laura's little picture to the point where it hits the big picture, and because of that meeting, we already have some potential conflicts we can use for the story. If Laura finds that island full of magic-ready gold and gems, her bosses will want to keep it secret, or else control how much comes out of the mines so that society will stay the same, and they will stay in power. However, Laura will want to shake up society, because she knows from that egalitarian rival nation that her life and the lives of all women could be better off. We've mixed the big picture and the little picture together, and now we have ourselves a story. Answers that ask questions. Another technique I just demonstrated with the Flying Islands example is something I like to call answers that ask questions. Even if the name is unfamiliar, you're almost certainly familiar with the concept. What happens is that you start with a question, you answer that question in a way that builds up your setting, and then you ask a new question that follows from that answer. What makes the Earth of my setting different from the real Earth? Well, in my setting, humanity has developed sentient robots. So, how does the manufacturer of those robots keep people from freaking out and thinking that robots are going to kill and replace us? By programming them all with the 3 laws of robotics that robots are completely unable to break, and the first law states that they cannot harm a human. So what happens if the robots figure out that emotional abuse is a thing? Or what happens when the manufacturer wants an expensive robot to preserve its own existence? Well, at that point you get the iRobot and the Rest of the Robot story collections by Isaac Asimov. The Answers That Ask Questions technique is useful whether you're working out or working in, so make as much use of it as you can. Story-sized preparations. Earlier, I said that a benefit of starting with a small picture is the fact that you won't waste time on creating setting details or background lore that your audience will never encounter. However, even if you're working from the big picture inwards, it's still a good idea to create just enough setting details to support your story. It can be rough, creating all kinds of amazing societies and histories and laws of physics that you'll never get to share with anyone else. And so in general, you should focus your efforts on the parts of the setting that you can include in your stories. J.R.R. Tolkien is famous for creating a whole mythology for his Middle-earth setting, a mythology that his son would eventually collect and publish after his death under the title The Silmarillion. For some of you, I'm sure that's exactly how you want to create your setting, by filling up notebook after notebook with ideas, historical characters, myths, cultures, and constructed languages. But if your goal when creating a setting is to share it with others, then for the sake of your own ego, you should always focus on the parts of your setting that your audience will encounter. The value of empty spaces. There are other reasons to avoid creating more of your setting than you need to. One reason is the value of an empty canvas. Fans will often use gaps in a setting to write fanfiction, or else create elaborate theories about what characters were doing when, or how different stories tie together. but you as the creator can use those blank spaces as well. Star Wars provides a great example of the kind of blank spaces I'm talking about. The very first film was given the title Episode 4, despite the fact that George Lucas had not created a single piece of Star Wars fiction before the movie came out, and when he added the 4 in a 1981 re-release, he was working on Episodes 5 and 6, not 1 through 3. Lucas created a blank space for himself, with the intention of filling it in later, and he would go on to allow dozens of authors to fill in the rest of his galaxy over the next several decades. Because empty spaces can be valuable, you don't have to answer every question you ask yourself about your setting, and you don't have to follow up every answer with a new question. This gives you a space you can use to write new stories, complete with new details that support your new stories, even if they're completely different from the last set you wrote. For instance, I never really nailed down what technology level the Flying Island setting uses. Maybe there isn't one, and each island society has its own unique technology level. If that's the case, I can create new stories away from the two main societies and use a variety of technology levels. By refusing to answer certain questions, I give myself more story opportunities. The value of feedback. The other big reason to avoid fully fleshing out your setting is because you will probably have an opportunity to get audience feedback about your setting in between stories. This feedback can be invaluable, and many times the extra eyes of the audience can spot inconsistencies, plot holes, and other moments where you thought you explained things well enough, but you forgot that not everyone can see it inside your head. Feedback like that gives you a chance to better explain yourself in a later story, or else you can use an inconsistency to create a new story that explains it. Audience feedback can also let you know what it is about your story and setting that people like, and what they might want you to focus on in future stories. It's always important to enjoy the stories and settings you create, but if your audience likes something specific and you don't mind focusing on that, then why not? A word of warning though, be careful how you use audience feedback. Sometimes appealing to one audience segment can alienate the others. Sometimes the vocal part of the audience doesn't actually know what it is about your setting that makes it great. Also, avoid rewriting your older stories as much as possible. Instead, try to add details that put your old stories into a new context. That way, the old inconsistencies aren't lies, they're just incomplete truths. Comic books do this all the time, and they get mixed results. So always try to use the lightest touch possible. You can create your setting from the outside in or the inside out, but regardless of which way you go, you should always remember to ask yourself questions and leave the margins of your setting blank. That way you can fill in details as you go along without ruining your setting's internal consistency. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.